Hi guys, welcome to our daily encounter. In Exodus chapter 32, we read about the golden calf. And it's interesting as you read the story of them building this golden calf, it follows very closely with the instructions that Moses received in the construction of the tabernacle. First off, you have a contribution that was made where they, in verse 2, Aaron tells them to tear off their gold rings, which are in their ears, and then the people tore off the gold rings in verse 3 and brought them to Aaron. You have the contribution. If you remember, with the instructions about the tabernacle, Moses is told to get a contribution from the people for all the materials that were to be made for the tabernacle. And then in verse 4, it has him actually fashioning with a graving tool and making these gold rings into a molten calf. And of course in the tabernacle, gold is used quite a bit in the tabernacle, and it was also going to be something that the people themselves would construct. And then it had an altar as well. In verse 5, it says, "And Aaron looked and built an altar before it." And so there was an altar before this golden calf, just as there would be an altar in front of the tabernacle. And not only that, there was a feast involved. It says, and Aaron made, in verse 5, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to Yahweh." And so there's going to be a feast. And of course, we know that with the tabernacle, there were going to be three main feasts that the people would come and worship the Lord there at those various feasts. But not only that, there'd be sacrifices as well. In verse 6, so the next day they rose early and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose to play. Sacrifices were involved as well. And so we can see that there seems to be a contrast here between the instructions that God gave in this tabernacle that was a copy of the heavenly tabernacle, as we read about in Hebrews chapter 9, and then this earthly construction of the people for not the worship of Yahweh, but for the worship of other gods, and one that was very earthly, and could even make an argument that was somewhat demonic as well. But nonetheless, we can see a contrast between the two. We can see the similarities in that there's a contribution, there's a construction, there is a feast, there are sacrifices, and things like that. But there's also a lot of a contrast as well, because this is something that the people themselves are conjuring up. This is something the people themselves are designing and constructing, and not based on what God had instructed. And so they're kind of doing their own thing, we could say. So as we think about this, we have to ask ourselves, are we doing the same thing? Are we doing the same thing? We know that in scriptures, we ought to be about building up God's temple. The church is the temple of the living God, we're told. And we have to be careful the way that we build on the foundation of Christ as we're building up this temple, this holy house before God, the church. And it ought to be that we are busy about building up God's kingdom, to build up God's house, to build up his temple, and to let it flourish and to grow. But oftentimes we find ourselves constructing our own house and constructing our own things and going about our own projects and doing things our own way. And oftentimes it might be things that look very similar to doing the work of the Lord, but we're really just doing them for ourselves. And something we have to be very careful about. We have to be very careful that we're building up God's house and not a golden calf. That we're not building up idols for ourselves, but that we are truly and wholeheartedly wanting to build something for God, and to be busy about building up the church, building up God's kingdom, using our gifts and our talents that he has given us to go out and bear fruit for the kingdom, and to really seek the kingdom and his righteousness above everything else, and to be intent on building God's things and doing God's work for His glory, and not the other way around, doing things for our own selves and for our own glory. So this chapter ought to cause us to take a little bit of a pause and to say, you know, what am I really working for in life? Am I really fulfilling my purpose? You know, not that there's anything wrong with us taking care of ourselves and taking care of our families. Of course, that's part of the responsibilities that we have, and those are good in and of themselves. But is that all we're living for? Are we purely living for ourselves, to construct something for ourselves that we can bow down to ourselves that isn't God? Are we putting something else above God? Hopefully, we'll take this text as a warning, where we can say, you know what, I want to get back to God's design. I want to go back to God's construction. I want to go back to building up things for the Lord, for Him to be glorified, so that I can worship Him and offer up sacrifices to Him. And again, hopefully our text will help us do that today. And with that, guys, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.